began my work with David in 2003 after hosting him as a visiting Temple lecture artist at Lafayette College, where I was a professor of art and teaching African American art history and printmaking. David came, presented his lecture, and we were both interested in each other's work. And I told him that I ran a printmaking institution, and I had printed artists like Sam Gilliam, Faith Ringo, and artists of this stature, Richard Anaskevich and others, and he said he'd like to make a print with me. So I was great honored to be in his company and that he would want to make a print with me. So we arranged the following spring for him to come in and start working on a print. And we developed an image called Brown Derby, which was a part of a larger portfolio. We had put together 8 artists, master artists, and 8 master printmakers, which is a multiple face etching, a beautiful etching. And we tried a number of images before we got to that. And as you see behind me, you see the preliminary sketch for that with his notations. Then you see a proof that we made, a line drawing to set up the scale that he'd like to have the print made in. Then we did a secondary proof and then a final image of the Brown Derby as an etching in sepia. This is a piece titled Chieftain's Chair, created by David Driscoll in 2011. This is a processed serigraph where a screen is produced to represent each color, and they're printed in successions, normally going from light to dark, or yellow to purple, or yellow to blue, for example. In this particular piece, we began with a large block of yellow, and we printed and finished with a final accent of white as well as black to create a border and also to give a sense of relief, mimic and imitate some of his textures in his paintings. So the way this is done is, as I mentioned, a screen is produced that records each color. Now colors are separated and a film is produced, and then the screen is produced from that film. For example, if you have a stroke of yellow in a painting, a screen would be made of just that yellow, for example. And here's a screen where we will print a first color of yellow, a block of yellow, to give an example to you. Then we charge the screen up with the color. Make sure it's distributed evenly. Then the screen is lowered over to the paper, and the ink is pulled evenly across the surface. So you would do this for each succession of color. Acrylic inks that we use to print are not the same as oil paint that he's using, so we'd have to tweak it and modify it. So if it's purely coming out of a container, it may not match up with the color palette that the artist would like. So sometimes it can be complicated. David was a painter who used quite a few colors and nuances, so he could have a palette that ends up being more than 20 colors to print on an image. So I think the next natural progression of our relationship and friendship and collaboration was my visiting David annually at his studio in Falmouth, Maine. So I would go up during the summer. I would take projects with me. We'd evaluate the project, sometimes even making a proof at his studio. And I would come back and finish those editions. But while I was there, we would travel to different places, visit Skowhegan, where he was on the Board of Governors, eat a lot of lobster, because you're in Maine. And David was a phenomenal cook. He would not only cook excellent meals, this country boy, you know, he was from the South, born originally, and he would cook these fantastic meals and always using vegetables from his own garden that he would grow. So we worked together in Maine in the summer, and then in the fall and winter, I would spend time with him at Hyattsville in the studio there. I was visiting him at his home, having him go over prints, approve prints, sign editions. We did this back and forth. And it would be a joke between him and his nephew, Rodney, that Curly's coming. You better have a plate for him to do it. So it was constant, you know. But it was it's interesting. This was just not the relationship between a master printer and a master artist, which had a great tradition of Joseph Saff and Rauschenberg, Picasso, and Marlette. It was a great tradition of master printmakers and artists working together. Keep in mind that a print is actually built. You're deconstructing the image and you're reconstructing it, so it is a building process. So first we would begin the process with a sketch, and then we would play with the scale of the sketch to find the appropriate scale that David would approve of. And you can see it increases in scale here. Then he does a pastel wash and some watercolor, identifying the range of colors he'd like to begin with. And we would translate that into a proof on plate, and then you could see the qualities of this is actually oil-based ink that we were using, very much like the painting. You can see the nuances, the tonality, not exactly like his study, but close. So again, to begin the process of developing the print. Then it would move to these various stages, a little brighter, a little lighter, a little richer green, a little warmer, a little darker blue, until we got to the point where David approved of that final version, and he would write notations to me about what color to enhance, what to focus on, and then we would get that final proof approved, and that's the print that we would edition. We produced as well 3 portfolios together. The first portfolio was called Doorway. It was 12 images produced with the poetry of Michael Albert, who was a noted poet from Maine. So we got together and collaborated on this project. And David would respond to his poetry, and he would respond to David's images. So it's a beautiful portfolio. It's in a number of major collections. A Doorway for David was a way in which he used art to enter into a different reality or different relationships. And he's produced a series of beautiful images. Temptation in the Garden, you know, the pine trees, you know, beautiful series. So after we completed the Doorway portfolio, we began to do the main suite that we produced over a 5-year period beginning in 2010. Following that, we did a small book in honor of David Driskell. Even my daughter actually wrote the text, and it was the memories he had of his mother and of his home. And inside the portfolio, we had 3 small relief prints that he had done especially for this. So it was both his story and images that went along with it. So that was the first time we mixed both like this. This particular piece was pre-cut. The block itself was cut, I think, in the 70s, if I'm not mistaken, and we didn't edition it until 2006. And it's titled Festival Thelma. It's a tribute to David's wife, Thelma. So we did variations of the process, color, monoprinting, where you lay a color down on a sheet, print that color, and then come back and print the relief block in that has been cut by David in his own studio. Sometimes crudely cut because his tools were not always the best printmaking tools. So there's a crudeness to it, but I think that's also signature David. His work is very organic. So these are examples where he would make notations. I would either send him a proof or he would visit the studio. He would make notations. Here it says good green, add cobalt blue, good green, good. Once I got involved with the David Driskell Center as a board member, then interim director, then a permanent director, David had an sort of ambiguity about this, because feelings of ambiguity about it, because he also didn't want me to leave the studio practice with him. But I was able to balance both, because I'd come to see him to report on some activity at the center, which I became director, and a colleague of his. So that's a totally different role. Here I am, someone who's charged with, as a master printer, to facilitate his creative ambitions as an artist. And then as a fellow academic is to celebrate his scholarship as an academic. So here I end up at the David C. Driscoll Center, and my role is to celebrate his legacy. Now, how did we do that? I did it in a number of different ways. I was so inspired by this that when I visited him once, I asked him, could I do a portrait of him? So I did a large pastel portrait and finally an etching from that as well. So that actually to have that moment of looking at him, and he's looking at me and he's posing. That is different than being in the studio with me. That's different than seeing him at a lecture hall. He described himself as a printmaker. When I first met him, after he started working for me, he realized he was not a printmaker. So we would he would clean the plates off, we would store them, and then we would edition them. But he had this habit also of picking up, wood that's thrown away, tabletops, bar tops, bar stool tops, and he would use them to cut the surface of his images. And this was terrible wood. It would be warped sometimes, extremely hard. So the lines were cut and kind of crude, but that was David's signature. What David did that has been so striking to me, and perhaps that is one of our fundamental connections, is his sense of humanity. In his practice as a scholar, his practice as a teacher, and also his practice in the studio. His sense of humanity was infectious. It would generate open discussions, a compassion for the other person in the environment. He was always generous with this, and it would cause his spirit to grow. It was interesting to see him in his dynamic with other artists of note. They were so honored to meet him, artists and historians, to get a chance to acknowledge to David how he had impacted their career and inspired them. And I would visit some of those artists with him, like Kerry James Marshall, Theaster Gates, and others. And the first thing when he walked into the studio, will you please sign our book? They would have his 2 centuries of Black art, and they would ask David to sign them. They had such reverence for him. One of the most important aspects of David's legacy is that he brought an attention to a body of material, creative material, of genius, of significance, not just of contribution that had been obscured or in the shadows of American history, but it was a symbol or an expression of not only humanity, but an existential reality that I am here. And it means something to be present. And David celebrated that. David held up a mirror that said, yes, it means something that you are here. And I will reaffirm you. His life and career was a reaffirmation of the goodness of spirit and the goodness of creative genius and how it could serve us. David was not an overtly political individual, but he was quite a change agent. And I think he understood early that he had to be at the table. He had to be at the table so he could argue the validity of the African-American artistic contribution, the cultural relevance, and how it reflected a fuller America. He did that not only in his scholarship, but he did that in his practice as an artist. He did talk once to me about when he was putting together the 2 Centuries exhibition for Los Angeles County Art Museum, and how there were questions by some of the board members about the merits of doing a show of African American art on the centennial. And he explained that we don't have to do your history because your history is documented. You know nothing about my history. That's why we have to do my history. And we're still having that conversation today. Not just a conversation about history, but identity and the value of that identity. So think about someone who spent their career arguing about the value of the African American experience. And here we're faced with a time where that value is being reevaluated, the human value, the value of that Black body, the value of that identity, and how it's still facing certain challenges. So it's interesting that David would be at an exhibition that was organized around African American art, and he would close his lectures by saying, it's time for these shows to end. Now this is someone who had to use those shows as a vehicle, but he says it's time for those shows to end. But what he was arguing was that it was time for this marginalized evaluation of this group of artists that were set aside, that these artists and their works were part of the larger American canon. David wanted to destroy that barrier and has gone a long way to doing it.